All right, let's do this. Hello, welcome to Yoga Talks Podcast. My name is Jay Brown. It is my pleasure to be with you again. I want to start by asking you if you're sitting at a screen right now, or if you're looking at a screen right now. Maybe we'll turn away from it, or we'll turn it off, or just listening, rather than having a screen in front of our eyes. And maybe that's just, I'm projecting. Those of you who've been listening for a while, you might remember back in the past, I talked a lot about my screen addiction. Well, I'm just completely off the wagon at this point. It's terrible. I think just with the stress of trying to buy this house and letting the center retire, it's just been like, I don't know, certain things have gone by the wayside, and one of those is me being more disciplined about using my phone and how much screen time I'm indulging in. And once again, just like in the past, I have to face it when I see like a thing happen with my kids around it. It's exactly what happened last time. You see, what's happening is I'll be like looking after one of my kids, like I was with my 2-year-old today, and she'll be playing and we'll be playing together, but then she'll get into something on her own and she'll be occupied. She won't need my attention. So that becomes an opportunity for me to do like a quick phone check. I'll whip out my phone. I'll maybe check a couple of emails. Then I might open up Safari and do a quick Facebook scroll. Yes, that's right. I'm admitting it. You remember I made a whole big deal about deleting the app. I deleted the app. And then like a bunch of you emailed me and said, I deleted the app too. And we were so proud of ourselves, right? How many of you are still going on your phone and doing Facebook without the app? I'm better about it in terms of Facebook just because I don't like Facebook so much anymore. But in any case, so I'm on my phone for a quick second doing whatever stupid crap that I don't need to do, but I'm doing because the phones are ridiculously addictive. And my 2-year-old will look up and see me on my phone. And then she'll say, oh, what's Daddy looking at on his phone? And she'll want to come over and see what I'm looking at on my phone. And usually I'm kind of in the middle of reading something maybe, right? Or looking at something. And so I know she's there looking at it, the phone, but it's just a little couple minutes, another minute, and then, okay, I'm done with that. And I see, and she's looking at the phone. Okay, let's turn off the phone now. I don't want my 2-year-old to be looking at this screen. Why am I even on the screen? Let's turn this off. And she'll freak out. She wants to keep looking at the phone. And right now, my 2-year-old is in typical 2-year-old mode, so she will melt down. She'll have a full meltdown. So I created a meltdown in my child because I had to do a stupid phone check, which I didn't need to do, but I did unconsciously. And then now she's having a meltdown. And, you know, frankly, I don't know if she's going to hear this. She hasn't really been listening to the podcast, but I saw it happen with my wife today too. Same shit. But she kind of blamed my daughter, like, why is she acting this way or whatever? And I'm like, what do you mean, why is she acting this way? The phones are completely addictive. They're addictive to us. The 2-year-old doesn't stand a chance. So you give her like 2 minutes of staring at the little black mirror and, you know, then you turn it off. It's like, of course she freaked out. So I don't know. I'm projecting. Maybe you're not having the same issues I am, but once again, I feel the need to say it out loud that I gotta get my use of these screens under better control. But I have been under an unusual amount of stress. Let me give you an update on the house, which that saga has actually continued a little bit. Last time I mentioned it, we had done this home inspection and we found a few things with the house that weren't on the seller's disclosure. Quite frankly, I think there were some things on the seller disclosure that were inaccurate. So we thought it was reasonable to ask for a few concessions. And when the woman, there's a couple that's selling us the home, the woman heard our proposal. She was reasonable and she came back with a counter offer. And that's why last week I said, oh, we're not far away. It should be fine. Seemed like everything was good to go. But then when the man heard it, he wasn't having it at all. In fact, he took a completely hardball line and said, what are you talking about? We're doing you a favor. It said as is on the contract. Take it as is or we're walking away. Like he was ready to like blow the whole thing up. Well, what I've learned since, and I'm not really supposed to know this, but they're like in the middle of a divorce. So we get one thing from her and another thing from him, and I think she's more of the driving force behind doing this for us. And so I think he kind of doesn't want to do anything that she wants to do, but he's not being totally unreasonable. And we are agreed upon the original terms. We're just going to eat it a little bit, but it's not that bad. So right now, the day that this is posting was the day I was supposed to sign on the bottom line, but there's a couple documents that were delayed from the city, so we're pushing it back a day or two. So it's still happening. The dream remains alive. Please, keeping fingers crossed, but we still can't celebrate yet. But thank you guys so much for your good wishes and your emails. It's really great. I'm so happy that there's people out there listening to this and feeling like they're connecting to it in some way, because otherwise it's just like hear me by myself spouting off. So when you email me and you tell me that, I really appreciate it. And please keep those coming. Let's talk about the podcast today. I am talking to Sam Rudra Swartz today. Sam is a guy over at Integral Yoga for many, many years. I didn't really know him before I had this talk with him. I was invited to do a talk at the Accessible Yoga Conference that is coming up on May 19th by Jivan Heyman. And I said, well, let's do a podcast about it. And he doesn't live around here, so he said, well, let me put you in touch with Rudra. And Rudra came by, and we had a really very cool talk, which you'll get to hear. I didn't know who he was. I have to admit, I was maybe like a little bit intimidated. One of the things that happened while we were scheduling is he said, well, is your yoga center wheelchair accessible? And fortunately, the center is, so we didn't have that issue. But again, as I was admitting last week, I have to admit, I was like, oh, okay, like I don't spend a lot of time with people in wheelchairs. Or again, we were going to be talking about the Accessible Yoga Conference, and sometimes I'm just feeling like, oh, am I the right person? So in any case, that got dispensed pretty quickly because, as you'll hear, Rudra and I got along just fine. And I thought we talked about some pretty cool stuff, in particular the Accessible Yoga Conference coming up. There'll be a link for you guys to check it out. So we'll listen to this talk that I had with Rudra. Before we do, let me mention some dates. I'm going to be in Montana at the Feathered Pipe Ranch June 17th through the 24th. And a couple of people had to drop out. Totally understand. Stuff happens, and it is quite a trek. You know, it's Montana, but I think that's the whole part of it. I'm really curious to have this time in this place. And if you can make it happen, if you've got some time and can swing some funds, I think it'll be pretty special. Montana, June 17th through 24th at the Feathered Pipe Ranch. I am also going to be in Finland, in Helsinki, Finland, August 23rd through 30th. Any international listeners, if you hear this and you're going to be somewhere around there, might come hang out with me there. You can find out about those events, and you can listen to the archives of the podcast. You can read my blog and find my yoga videos at jbrownyoga.com. What else? Oh, I wanted to mention some upcoming things with the podcast. I recorded my first ever podcast in front of a live audience at the Yoga Journal conference here in New York City, which was really something. My buddy Andrew Tanner from the Yoga Alliance is the one who made that happen. He and I have become friends, and we recorded a talk about what's going on with the Yoga Alliance. And there is quite a bit going on with the Yoga Alliance. I'll mention more as that podcast episode nears its posting. But the other thing that came out of it is I was invited to the presenters' dinner, which I guess is a little bit of a somewhat exclusive engagement. Andrew was like, "You want to come with me to the presenters' dinner? There might be some people there. You could talk to them about coming on the podcast." And I said, "That sounds cool. Let's do that." So I went to the Hilton Midtown on a Friday night, or was it Saturday night? And there was like a kind of like hors d'oeuvre dinnery gathering. And there was some pretty heavy hitters. Richard Freeman was there, and I really wanted to talk to him, and I didn't get a chance to talk to him. I actually tried to send a message to him, and I don't know, anybody out there knows Richard, can help me get him on the podcast. I would love to talk to Richard Freeman. I did not get to talk to him that night. I did get to talk at some length with Rodney Yee, and it's a pretty funny story, but Rodney Yee and I got into a bit of a heated exchange. It was really something. I'm going to tell that story another time, but it is really a story. You'll have to listen. Maybe next week I'll tell you that. But me and Rodney Yee met, and I guess there's an off chance that he said he would come on the podcast, but I don't know. But the big thing that I wanted to tell you is not about my altercation with Rodney Yee, which I know I just teased you again. Kate, if you're listening, ha! But I'll tell you next week. In any case, the big news for me from that night was something that no one's been really talking about, which is that Yoga Journal has decided to some degree to stop doing the conferences, which is huge. I mean, anybody who's been around remembers a time when the conferences were like a really big deal. And I wrote about it not so long ago that I felt like the conference's like influence was waning in favor of the festivals, the Bhakti Fest and the Wanderlusts. And sure enough, that is exactly what happened, because at that presenters meeting, the woman from Yoga Journal, whose name is eluding me right now, she spoke about how, the conferences haven't been able to compete with those festivals. They're less money. They're in exotic locations. The same big name teachers do both. And really, for me, as I wrote about, the conferences used to be more about exposure and education rather than like big event. But in any case, they've decided for this year, they're not really doing any more conferences. They were usually do like 6 or something. And they're only going to be doing 2. They're not doing any more until next year. They were already contracted for another one here in New York. And I think the plan is to try to do like a reset and to reimagine what they would be and then try something new next year, I guess. I don't know. But it's a big deal. That's an institution, Yoga Journal conferences, and they may be gone forever. But I was at the last one here in New York. I did record a very engaged conversation with Andrew, and that's going to play in 2 weeks. Next week, I'm going to talk to Jivana Heyman, who we talk about some in this talk today, but I ended up doing a separate talk with him that is also quite fantastic, so that'll be next week. Lastly, if you've been enjoying the podcast and you'd like to show some support, you could do that by going to iTunes and writing a review and subscribing, or going to a blog or podcast page and making a direct donation. Any of those things are deeply appreciated. Really, though, I'm just immensely grateful to you for listening and for being in contact. Really, I love it when I hear from you guys. Please feel welcome to reach out at jbrownyoga.com. All right. I think that's good. Let's get to it. Let's hang out on a Sunday evening at Abhyasa Yoga Center in Williamsburg, Brooklyn with Sam Rudra Schwartz.
Hello. Test.
Indeed. We are at Abhyasa Yoga Center.
Metropolitan Avenue, Brooklyn, New York.
You made it here on a Sunday night.
The Berg of Williams accessoride, who is known for being late, gave me a 6:04 pickup time. I arrived at 6:47 while you were engaged in a yoga class. I found Sunak natural foods.
But as you said, it's the natural food mart that doesn't have very natural food in it.
They have some natural foods mixed in with Frosted Flakes and cigarettes behind the juice bar. Get a healthy smoothie with vegan protein and a pack of Marlboros at Sunak Natural Foods.
You see, but that pretty much goes to kind of a big issue for me right now.
And what is that, Jay? Tell me about it.
Well,
let's talk about your issues for a minute.
Welcome to this podcast, Rudra. I don't know if you've listened to my podcast, but unfortunately, sometimes my issues do come into play. But we're gonna talk.
How can they not? Everything is biographical to some nature. Is that not true?
I think so, and it takes a little bit of gusto to decide to do a podcast. Anyways, I think
that's true. Although people always recommend this podcast, that podcast, this movie, that movie, this movie, this TV show you got to binge watch. It's like I barely have enough time to do anything, but or at least it seems hard to find time to still do the stuff that I want to do. But once in a while I'll catch a podcast. Not like, I'm a big fan of this podcast, but like for years people were saying Mark Maron's WTF podcast, you got to check it out.
Yeah.
And
I'm a big fan of it.
Do you listen to that one?
I do regularly.
So did you hear the Kristen Wiig one?
I believe so.
That one blew my mind because she just gets so raw with him and tells her history, and that was beautiful. And then he did one with Robert Kelly, who's a stand-up comedian. Are you familiar with him?
I am. I heard that one too.
Oh, so Robert Kelly and I are good friends from Boston, our Boston days.
Okay.
When I was in Boston. I was only in Boston for 4 years, but he and I met through another comedian, Al Del Benny, who's now in Australia with his family. And I've known Robert for years. We've done some crazy things together. And then I listened to this podcast and I learned more about his history than I ever did.
You see, that's perfect because this podcast is entirely inspired by that podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've kind of wanted this to be like that for yoga people rather than comedy people.
WTFY.
So, something like that. But in the sense that even as you just said, we're so busy, but we nailed down an hour right now where you and I are just going to sit here and have a conversation. And that's sort of what I'm so hungry for.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. We're going to have a great real chat. And it's all you need is 3 yoga blocks, professional recorder, a couple microphones, your laptop. And a yoga studio, an available yoga studio.
We don't even need the yoga studio. We could have done this pretty much anywhere.
And the acoustics in here are actually great.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not too boomy and they're perfect. It's I feel like I'm in the studio.
See, you know what's up. You know what's up. But the other thing I wanted to say before we went on this little sidetrack is that you were talking about Sunak and the natural foods, and the neighborhood was different when I moved in here 10 years ago. That's all I'm going to say.
I remember it 20 years ago, and I had friends. When I got off the accessoride and saw Metropolitan in Lorimer, I was like, I think my friend Elizabeth used to live right here.
So I don't know. I'm really grappling with that.
So what was 10 years ago like?
I just think it was much more a more artist community. We all came from the East Village because the rents got too high, and we came here and we made lives for ourselves here. And we wrote it for a while, but at a certain point, the rents get to a point and you get priced out. I mean, it happens everywhere. I was in the Greenwich Village, then I was in the East Village, then I was in the Lower East Side.
So you followed the wave of Bohemia.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But now I'm in my 40s and I got kids. And that was my 20s.
Right, sure.
And also, I don't know where the wave of Bohemia went. Like, where is it?
I don't know. I mean, from what I hear, a lot of people are saying it's not in New York anymore. Although, wait, that's not true, because I guess Bushwick. I think Bushwick.
No, I was at the Jefferson stop, and there's a little glimmer, but that's not going to last long.
Bushwick's getting...
Yeah, it's gone already. I don't know. I feel like people are like moving to Philly or like Detroit.
Yeah, I've heard people going to Philly.
Yeah.
Detroit, I think, is the Bohemia's next up because there's so many places out there. Like my friend and I were like, let's open Integral Yoga Detroit. And we were looking at the place, and there were like places in downtown Detroit that were just like, really low rent from what you expect from an urban market.
Right, but then people got to come and stuff. But
that's true. People got to follow it.
People got to come. Well,
yeah. How
anyways,
many kids do you have?
What's that?
How many kids do you have?
I've got 2 kids.
How old?
7 and 2.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so... Anyways, I've been thinking a lot about this neighborhood. The lease for this place goes up at the end of this year.
No kidding.
I got to decide.
Are you expecting them to...
I already got the numbers. And
Was it a hellacious jump?
It wasn't hellacious. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was I don't know. I hesitate to say reasonable because the numbers are already stupid.
Were they stupid before?
No, relative to
right now, they're
relative to the neighborhood, like price per square foot for this neighborhood.
Right.
He gave me numbers to try to keep me more than to get rid of me, I think.
At the end of this year.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So you think he wants to keep you?
Yeah, he lives upstairs and he likes us, and he's a businessman. Like, I talked with him before he gave me the numbers, and I made the case. The L's going to shut down. Nobody knows what that's going to do. And
they're already talking in Manhattan that they're going to shut car traffic down on 14th Street to have special shuttles going all the time. So L's in Manhattan down 14th Street, only buses, no cars on 14th Street in Manhattan.
Whoa!
I heard that rumor because that's going to affect us because that's our stop. The
you guys
end
are
of the L is
Street,
our
right?
stop. Yeah.
See, nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going to happen.
Is everybody
with that.
freaking out here about the L?
Nobody's freaking. Everybody's just like, yeah. But I don't know. It's going to have an impact. And so, anyways, I don't know. I have to decide what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So when you bring up Sunak and the neighborhood, I'm like, yeah, that's sort of an issue. But
let's just put natural foods on it. And we'll get some naked smoothies and have a juice bar. And sell our cigarettes.
We're not here tonight to talk about me and the neighborhood.
No, really quick, where do you live? Do you live nearby?
I live right around the corner.
Oh, you do?
But I'm also going to have to move because we were on a handshake lease for 6 years. And then the guy's older and he turned it over to a management company. So now it goes up every year. That's not sustainable.
No.
So anyways, what I want to say is that, we are starting into this conversation in a really lovely way. I like it.
Yes.
Thank you. And, for me, what's bringing us together is the Accessible Yoga Conference. And
of which you are a presenter.
Well, no, I'm just leading a discussion.
You're a panel moderator, we'll call it. Yeah.
See, but that brings me to something that I wanted to start with you today because we talked about me being a presenter some. Mm-hmm. And as I was mentioning to you on your way in, I do align with the type of practice that its hallmark is adapting to the individual needs of the student. Mm-hmm. So in terms of making practice that I teach as accessible as I can to the people who have come, that's kind of a song I've been singing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Before there was the conversation that's happening about it now, frankly, before yoga was mainstream enough for anybody to be having that conversation.
Sure.
But now that conversation's happening, I often feel like I'm not the right person. Like the charismatic white male at the front of the room telling people who have needs that are different from him what the deal is about whatever.
Right.
I feel like we're kind of done with that. Mm-hmm. And so I've been really coming up against my white male privilege and wanting to understand that more. Mm-hmm. And I don't know your heritage, you seem white male-ish to me.
White male, Jewish.
Yeah, okay, so we're in
white
some
male,
of that same
Jewish,
boat.
In New York for 20 years,
But you've also come in a wheelchair.
Right.
And so when it comes to making yoga accessible, you know about that in a way that I don't know about that.
Well, so... the Accessible Yoga Conference grew out of something called Accessible Yoga Teacher Training. So the founder of the organization which organizes the conference, Reverend Jivana Heyman, is an integral yoga teacher. So he was actually running the Integral Yoga Institute of San Francisco, which is a sister Integral Yoga Institute to the one in New York where I live. So they both Integral Yoga in New York and San Francisco are both ashrams where people live an ashram lifestyle, as well as, active yoga institutes for everybody. What happened when Jivana had taught there for so many years is that he was teaching like a gentle class. And he had students that couldn't necessarily do a level 1 integral yoga class. And integral yoga is already a more gentle, sort of easier practice.
Yeah,
so
eye rolls and shavasanas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Long yoga nidra. I've had students that come into my level 1 class and won't do 50, 60% of the asana because they're mostly there to be in the vibration. They're mostly there for the yoga nidra and the meditation. And they can do some of it. And I also teach gentle classes. So Jivana had what I have here, gentle yoga classes. And he had these people that were really practicing yoga. I mean, so many people I talk to as a yoga teacher, I'm sure you do, that will say, the layman will say, I could never practice yoga. I'm not flexible, And I'm sitting here in Abhyasa Yoga Center, and the term Abhyasa, which translates to effort towards steadiness of mind, the yogi knows that yoga is about the mind, not the body, right? So Jivana had these students that had these amazing practices that were adapted to their own bodies, and their bodies couldn't do that much. But at the core of his background, my background, integral yoga, like you said, eye movements, warm-ups, sun salutation, back bend, forward bend, inversion, twist.
Rests in between.
Rest, lots of rest in between. And then once you've done all that asana, a long rest. And the long rest isn't just, we call it deep relaxation. It's not designed for just to relax. It's not like nap time. It's not like yoga nap time. It's designed to take you through the levels of your consciousness. So you've engaged your body. Right? You've gently stretched your body. You moved your body in different directions. You move your spine in different directions. Front, back, side to side, up, lots of up. Lengthen down. Just basics that any body can do.
Even in a chair.
Right. And with this conference coming up with Matthew Sanford as the keynote speaker who wrote the wonderful book Waking, and he talks about how rediscovering his energetic body, even though his physical body was so damaged that he was paralyzed. Now, I'm in a wheelchair. I'm not fully paralyzed. I have a joint condition. It's just, I use crutches, but it's just very painful to get up on my crutches and to move. And it's a condition that came later in life. It wasn't like an accident and then it happened.
I see. So when did it get to the point where you had trouble walking?
Exactly. We're sitting here in March. It was exactly 10 years ago. It was exactly 10 years ago that I surrendered and said, I need a wheelchair. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
About a year before that, I couldn't walk down the street. I was walking down New York City streets using parking meters when they actually had parking meters every few feet. Yeah. And they were my canes at one point where I would just pull myself down the street using parking meters. But I went to the hospital and took physical therapy and got canes, and then I ended up in a wheelchair.
Wait a second. I'm sorry. I was doing a little bit of reading about you before maybe tonight, and if I'm not mistaken, that you had another condition you were dealing with, John Hopkins.
Hodgkin's disease.
Hodgkin's.
So actually, my joint condition first started.
Okay.
And I got it under sort of control with rheumatologists and anti-inflammatory.
Okay, so the meds.
Anti-inflammatory meds, which I wasn't crazy about, and I knew that wasn't sustainable because I knew that there were professional athletes who didn't have an inflammatory condition like mine, but they had inflammation from their professional sports, and had to start taking the same type of anti-inflammatories that I was taking, who ended up with kidney failure, just towards the end of their professional career. So I knew that wasn't sustainable, and I wasn't crazy about it, but I was doing it. And then I had chemotherapy for Hodgkin's disease, and then with the chemotherapy, and my body was totally different then. And I had done some holistic fasting, and I found yoga during that time. I
During
met a
the
woman,
first illness?
No, right after chemotherapy was when I first found yoga.
So when did that happen? How did that happen?
That was about 2000. Finding yoga at all.
Yeah.
Finding yoga at all is a great story for me. Is that so? I just had, I've been having this joint condition at the time for about, I guess, close to 3 years. I had just finished chemotherapy for Hodgkin's disease, and I was waiting tables. I had been taking anti-inflammatories, but then you have chemotherapy, and I didn't really need even anti-inflammatories at that point because the chemo, pretty much wipes away the immune system and takes almost everything away, and then you're in a rebuilding phase. And during my rebuilding phase, I got into holistic cleansing and fasting and things like that, and vegan blended juice fasting. And but I was waiting tables through all of it, So
Okay.
I was waiting tables. I started limping. I started taking anti-inflammatories. I was still waiting tables on anti-inflammatories. I have Hodgkin's disease. I'm still waiting tables. I'm in chemotherapy. I went from having a ponytail at my tables to having a shaved head. So I was working as a waiter all through that stuff.
All through your cancer treatment.
Yeah. And I had moved to New York. I had finished my music degree. I had finished my acting degree. So I was doing that thing, looking for music auditions, trying to play music gigs, looking for acting auditions, waiting tables. Like that was my thing. Just like millions of other people. Mm-hmm. But waiting. It was always my main source of income. So I'm waiting tables on a Friday night in Soho at a place called Broome Street Bar. And a customer of mine orders a bacon blue cheeseburger, only eats part of it, and as a good waiter, I say, "Oh, is everything okay with your burger?" She said, "Yeah, I'm really a vegetarian when I'm at home, but when I'm on the road, I like to see if my body can still handle meat. So that's why I got the burger. It was okay. It was fine and great. That's interesting. I'm on this cleanse right now. I haven't been vegetarian, but I think after I'm done with this pretty intense cleanse, I'm going to, stick to vegetarianism." And she said, "Oh, well, do you practice yoga?" I said, "I'd like to, but I don't really know where to start." And so she pointed me towards integral yoga. And she went over to the bookstore we have on 13th Street, put some stuff aside. And now 15 years later, I live, I have to go through that bookstore to get home. To go up to my room where I live, I have to go through that bookstore. Where I initially bought, ready for this, 2 cassette tapes with mantras on them. And
I got a box in my basement with
a couple bucks,
some mantra tapes.
And a couple books, a couple
some Vyas Houston mantra
exactly.
tapes.
Yeah, exactly.
So wow, so that
Om Shanti and the Mahamrityunjaya mantra. I used to press play on the cassette. It was great. 30 minutes. You put it on before bed and you go to sleep, listen to Om Trayambakam Yajamahe, and then 30 minutes later you hear click, but you're already asleep, so you don't really hear it.
Wow, so that woman who did that for you and pointed
Jillian
you in that
Rothschild is her
Did you
name.
get to see her again later on after that? Did you get to connect with her? Did she know that you became a teacher and stuff?
I'm due for a check-in just to let her know, because last summer I was ordained into the Integral Yoga Ministry, which was even another step of involvement. But I lived at Yogaville in Virginia, which is our really main ashram center in Virginia, in Buckingham County, Virginia. And that sits on almost 1,000 acres. And so that's kind of like the home headquarters now. Where I live in New York City was the second center that was opened in Swami Satchidananda's name as Integral Yoga Institute. When he came from the East in 1966, their first center was an apartment on West End Avenue. Then in 1970, they're in the building where I live.
Well, I got here in 1990, and that center on 13th Street's been there since I got here. That's for sure.
Yeah, no. Yeah, and what's interesting is 90, you mentioned 90, and 87 was their main... 87 was their main remodeling to its current incarnation. Mm-hmm. Of course, some things have changed, and we're always, But so then they moved. Then they had people move to San Francisco, and then they had little satellite locations all over the world. All over the world, but all over the country as well first, and then people opened centers elsewhere in the world, and then we had an ashram in Connecticut, but they couldn't build the temple there, and then they found this property. Then they were going to maybe build it in Santa Barbara, California, but that didn't work out. So then they found this huge piece of property in Virginia, and that's now our sort of main ashram and headquarters, Yogaville, Virginia, it's called.
Okay, so how do we get from you going over to the bookstore to pick up a couple things that she laid out for you and being like, oh, maybe I'm going to be vegetarian, which is kind of interesting. I've always said to people, like, there's a yoga to, like, drinking where I always say, like, to stop after the second one.
Right.
So in a way, like, that woman choosing to just eat some of that hamburger seems to be very yogic, even though she was eating meat. Like, I'm not somebody who feels like but so how do we get from that moment where you go over there to the Integral Center to you, like, moving into the ashram? So
okay, that's interesting, and it'll bring us back to the whole Accessible Yoga Conference and my involvement there. Because so what had happened was, so now I'm in a wheelchair, and I actually, my first wheelchair was bought by my friend who was living down near. What's that?
I'm sorry, I want to interrupt you, because when does that? How long after that moment when she sent you the books? When do you end up in the wheelchair from there?
2001. I'm on this fast. I just finished chemotherapy. 2006, I'm using canes. 2007, I move out of New York City. I'm living with my friend who actually buys me my first wheelchair. He's in the Navy, and he and his wife are kind of transient because she's moving Navy bases and he's getting out of the Navy, but they say, come live with us. He buys me a wheelchair. You need a wheelchair. I had an apartment in New York City that I had only gone down to visit him in actually Georgia, right near the Florida border. But my friend Eduardo buys me this wheelchair. And the wheelchair, the only reason we bought the wheelchair is, and speaking of exactly 10 years ago, we were going to spring training baseball games. I was visiting for spring training baseball games. And he's like, yeah, don't go back. Just hang with us for a while. And that led to me giving up my apartment.
But weren't your didn't you have doctors at this time? Like, isn't the decision to have a wheelchair, aren't they in on that?
So, not at first. And what happened is I was still traveling back and forth to New York City because I was already ordained as an interfaith minister, but not an integral yoga minister. I'd already gone through the All Faiths seminary program. So I had weddings back in New York. I had a music performance back in New York. So I'm living with my buddy in Georgia. My body is so happy it's now in a wheelchair. Okay. I'm traveling back to New York for a wedding. I'm traveling back to New York for a performance. One of the trips I see my doctor, I had fallen in Georgia, and she sees something on this scan. I was still in follow-ups for Hodgkin's disease at this point. This is only 6 years after chemo. So they're still regularly checking for lymphoma. So she sees a fracture in my bone, and she's like, don't leave New York. Like, don't go back to Georgia. And that was right when my buddy and his wife were moving bases, and he was getting ready to get out, and they were getting out of their house and all this stuff. So she says, don't leave New York. He says, you can't really come back to Georgia. I'm staying with friends here in Brooklyn, over by Prospect Park, and I have nowhere to go. So I call my friend at the ashram in Virginia, and she says, come here. So I go down there, and I try and get in the residential program there. Their response is, we don't really have anything accessible. But then that September, I have to be back in New York. So this a month later, after staying with her for a month, August of 2007, the month later I have to be in New York. I happen to run into somebody from the New York Center in Virginia. And I say, I have to be in New York for a month for the Jewish high holidays. I was assisting a rabbi running her services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So I see my friend in Virginia from the New York Center, and I say, look, do you think I could stay at the center in New York? Because I'd kind of overstayed my welcome in Brooklyn with my friends because I'd said I was going to come for this 1 week trip, and the doctor's like, don't leave New York. But then to get another doctor's appointment to check out what she saw on the scan with a fractured hip, they were like, oh, we can see you in September. This is July. But so I can't really stay in my friend's place in Brooklyn anymore. I can't really go back to Georgia. So I end up in Virginia, try and get in the residential program. They say no. But while I'm there, I run into a friend who arranges for me to stay as a guest in the New York Center. I go to the New York Center, stay for a month, do the Jewish holidays, and that was pivotal for me because here I am now having to have a meditation and hatha yoga practice. First time I'm actually, you're staying as a guest, you have to join sadhana.
Once you're in there, you're part of the program.
Right. So from meeting Jillian in 2001 and taking level 1 classes back then intermittently for 5 years for 5 or 6 years before I go on this transient period. I know integral yoga. I know integral yoga meditation. I've been to lots of gentle classes, not in a wheelchair. I've been to a few level 1 classes. So I know integral yoga. But now I'm in a wheelchair. I'm staying as a guest at the Integral Yoga Ashram of New York, where you have to go to morning meditation. You have to go to morning hatha practice. And I'm sitting in my wheelchair and I'm looking at the piece of paper that has eye movement, sun salutation, back bend, forward bend. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to do that in my wheelchair. I hadn't even taken a chair yoga class up to that point. Mm-hmm. But I said, I'm looking at this piece of paper. I know this. This is integral yoga. Mm-hmm. Right?
You had done it when you weren't in a chair.
Absolutely. I'd done level 1 classes. I'd done a lot of gentle yoga classes that they have in integral yoga. The same class I teach now, gentle yoga. So to get back to what we were talking about, Jivana, and you have all these students in San Francisco that...
Wait a second. I don't want to go to Jivana yet.
Okay, we'll get back to
We'll get back to Jivana. I want to stay here because I'm curious about this... this is something that's happened in a lot of the stories that get told on the podcast about how people end up making yoga like their life direction. That often, and it was true for me, it's kind of like when everything falls apart. Like when everything falls apart, that's what's there.
Yeah.
And that seems like that's what happened for you. Like you went through that whole period and then it all kind of, like you don't have anywhere else to go. And the one place to go was there.
Yeah.
And also the idea that the initial kind of phase is there's a discipline.
Right.
Like I wasn't in an order that was like doing that, but I did that. Like I had to do that.
Right.
Everything was out of control. So it was sort of like this first step was like, I got to be more in charge of what's happening.
Right.
With me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for me, I was living with my buddy and then I was staying with friends in Brooklyn, and then I couldn't go back to Georgia. And then, I went and stayed with my friend in Virginia. And then, it was this period of my life 10 years ago where I said, okay, I'm homeless. Mm-hmm. I'm virtually homeless, but always fortunate enough, and with my stuff enough together, which is debatable. You know what I mean? I'm disabled at this point. I can't get around without a wheelchair, but I have crutches. I'm learning what it means, to live in a wheelchair, and the limitations that creates, especially in a place like New York City. Mm-hmm. I'm on the road basically constantly, but fortunate enough, that I still have a roof over my head. And for the 3 or 4 year period before that I call it my transient period, my homelessness with always a roof over my head. I thank God always had a place to land, which only gave me more compassion for people who don't have a place to land. Opened my eyes to without my best friend in Georgia, nothing. Without my friends in Brooklyn, nothing. And my teacher, Rabbi Gelberman, who ordained me in the All Faith Seminary, once told a joke that I was at one of his classes and other students were saying, oh, I know Sam. This was before I got the Sanskrit name Rudra. Oh, I know Sam from Siddha Yoga. Oh, I know Sam from Integral Yoga. And Rabbi Gelberman pointed at me at one point and goes, oh, him? He's everywhere. And it was true. At that time, I was with Rabbi Gelberman. I went to a synagogue in Hell's Kitchen where I was helping with the high holidays. I would go to Siddha Yoga on Tuesday nights and on Sunday mornings. I would go to Integral Yoga for gentle classes and open meditation. Mm-hmm. But for me, that period in August of 2007, when I landed at my friend's house at the ashram in Virginia, moved to a month go visit my family in Texas, moved to a month at the ashram in New York City. Things go so well in New York City that I end up saying to Yogaville, look, I know you're not fully accessible, but things are really working at the ashram in New York. Give me a chance to make the living yoga training program at Yogaville work for me, even though things aren't totally accessible there. I understand, but let me give it a try.
Well, you just spent a month there.
Well, I spent it at New York City, where I had to where I still park my wheelchair by the elevator and use my crutches to get to my room, use my crutches to get to the bathroom. Mm-hmm. But at Yogaville, it meant climbing stairs to get to my room.
So you were proposing to do it at Yogaville.
I was proposing to do the light program at Yogaville, and the light program director at the time said, I think, we really don't have accessible accommodations for you. I said, just, in my heart of hearts. And this was also the time where I really can say that's when I really started feeling that Swami Satchidananda was my guru, where I really felt like I'm a disciple of his, because I felt like in my heart, I really, even though Rabbi Gelbin was like, who, him, he's everywhere, and he was my teacher, and, I felt a connection to Guru Mai and Baba Muktananda at Siddha Yoga, and, I started to feel more and more Jewish as I was getting into Jewish ritual. I was landing at Integral Yoga, and I was like, this man with the beard has had my back the whole time. And it almost felt like, when for me, it was like, that's the sign that this is the one, the guru is everything, right? The guru is part of everything. But for me, I was like, this was really the calling. It's like, you're going to land here. It's, I kind of felt like I was under his wing at that time. And he was saying like, okay, it's time to focus you up. You're with me and I got you covered. And it was like that, because I did end up in the light program in the fall of 2007.
That's what motivated you, right?
Yeah.
That feeling, you're like, I'm coming.
Right. I left that program after a month in November of 2007. And from the moment I left, my buddy, who was my roommate at the ashram, drove me to the airport in Washington, Dulles, and I missed my flight to Texas, and I was losing my mind. And I was like, what happened? You just meditated every morning at 5 a.m. for a month, and you're losing your cookies here at the airport because you missed your flight by 3 minutes, and you want to yell at this ticket agent at the gate, like, how could you let the plane come back? It's like, what happened to Yoga Boy? You know what I mean? Like, what happened? Like,
it didn't find its way outside the bubble. See, that's sometimes
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. But so from the moment I leave the ashram, I know I got to get back, and it takes me 6 months to get back to Virginia. And after about 10 months in Virginia, and practicing every day, meditating, I knew that I'm not rural boy. I'm not supposed to be here. And I looked at Swami Satchidananda's picture one night in my dormitory at Yogaville. I said, I think it's time to move on, but I don't know where to go. And within a few days, I think it was even the next day, that same friend who I had ran into a year and a half before, who connected me to staying for a month in September, brought a teacher training group down that same time and said, oh yeah, bedrooms opening up at the ashram in New York. And I was just like, really? Like, really? And he's like, yeah.
That's for you.
And he said, but if you're interested, somebody else is interested. So you better write to Swami Ramananda, like, really fast, and let him know you might be interested. And so I did. And then that August of 2000, this is 2009 now, so it was almost 2 years. So in August of 2009 is when I moved to where I am now at the Integral Yoga Institute in New York. And then a year after that, right? Okay, so you see how I'm like...
I can see it. Well,
first of all, roof over my head, and I keep ending up at Integral Yoga Ashrams.
Well, that seems to me to play into also why you feel him to be your guru. That's where you're being drawn, where life's pointing you. Also, so significant though that like you were like pioneering like them to make accessible. Like, I'm going to come there. You're not prepared for me, but I'm going to come there and we're going to make it happen somehow. Yeah. How did that work out? How were you getting up the stairs?
Well, I was crutching up the stairs, and now when I go visit there's 2 rooms that are accessible in there. They kind of have these motel buildings. And one of those 2 motel buildings, which has an accessible room that every other trip, I switch between 2 different accessible rooms there now. One of the rooms, it was funny, they were breaking ground on this building when I lived there in 2000, and I think it was late 2008 that they were breaking ground on this new building. And I think I said, I asked them, I said, oh, is this new building going to have an accessible room? And they said, yes, one of the rooms is going to be fully accessible. And I looked at my friend and I go, dibs.
See, but that's what I'm talking about. Like you played some role, I imagine.
Well, so there's another Swami, another Swami. There's a Swami who lives down at Yogaville, Swami Sudananda. And she's very much been my inspiration. She has a very severe disability. Now, I remember we used to say it was cerebral palsy, but recently she said she's got a different diagnosis about something else, and I don't remember the name of it. But she's used crutches and been in a wheelchair and lived at Yogaville for more than 20 years, maybe even 30. And we first met when I was not in a wheelchair. I was using crutches, and I came down for a weekend program. And I was just talking to a friend earlier today about integral yoga, and one of the things we love about it is that Swami Satchidananda had this mischief about him, and he had this sense of humor, and even though English wasn't his first language, he did a lot of wordplay that I think he only managed because he was a foreigner who spoke English. But he did. So there's this lightheartedness about people who've been in integral yoga. And so I go down for a weekend program at Yogaville, and I'm using my canes. And Swami Sudananda looks at me, and she goes, Sam, you're making us Crips look bad when you can just pop down to Virginia from New York City for a weekend and back.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.